All right, good morning. My name is John Diaz. I'm a staff technical marketing architect with VMware, and I'm going to step you through several of the, or all of the pillars that Taruna just spoke about. So we'll just work through these one at a time. And we'll start off with optimized performance and show you some of the capabilities we have there. Now, as we've discussed, one of the things that we want to do is, as you're planning or managing your data center, a lot of customers want to become more cloud-like in the way that they manage their data center capacity. They need to understand and meet SLAs for the business and also operational policies, and they want to be proactive. So we provide a way to do that with something called workload optimization. And the way that works is, when you go into workload optimization, and I'll show all data centers here, you can look at your environment by either the data centers as they exist natively within the vCenter, vSphere construct, or you can actually create your own custom data centers and subdivide that into environments like production versus test. Could be different SLA tiers. You'll see down here host-based licensing is one of those. So we'll talk about a couple of the different use cases that we have. And you'll notice on here that some of the workloads or some of these data centers say not optimized, which would be, in this little area here, and some will say optimized. And that's an indication that we are either meeting or not meeting the policies that we've set up for how we want to operationalize our data centers, resources, the workloads from the business that run on those, and we'll talk about that primarily in this section. Some other information that you'll see on here, we also provide information about potential cost savings that you can achieve. We'll talk about that more when we get into the capacity part. And then we are also looking at the red, yellow, and green indicators are telling us how much time we have remaining before we run out of resources. So that's just kind of an overview of this dashboard. But let's look at a couple of scenarios. One, the first scenario is kind of this cluster-based placement use case. And a lot of customers have environments that, some clusters are newer than others, faster equipment, faster servers rather, better storage. Maybe they have, more higher powered CPUs, faster CPUs, more memory available or installed on those. And then they have, older equipment that they're still depreciating, but they want to continue to use that. In our use case here, we have a gold tier and a silver tier, two different clusters, and we'll use a cluster-based policy to manage placement for those workloads and also ensure that those workloads are where they're supposed to be, in addition to allowing the lower tier workloads, the silver workloads, to be able to consume the higher tier if there's capacity available, and that gives us the benefit of getting more value out of the investment that we made in that newer gear. So the way that we do this is, you'll see two cards here, this operational intent card and the business intent. So if you kind of align this with thinking about self-driving cars, I'm setting my route, I'm setting my preferences for my route, I'm setting things like, how much, if I want to get there quicker, if I want to conserve fuel, if I want to make additional stops and so forth. So think of the intents as that kind of a policy. So if I go into the business intent, for example, I have two options. In this case, we're using cluster-based placement. So we're managing the clusters based on vSphere tags that indicate what tier they are. So we have some clusters and hosts tagged as gold tier with, again, the newer, faster equipment. And then we have the older gear that's our silver tier. We also have our VMs tagged that way as well. So our business critical workloads that we want to make sure have access or running on our newest, fastest, best equipment will also have a gold tag. and then maybe the secondary or lower in the business criticality layer virtual machines would have a silver tag in vSphere. And this is all done through vSphere tagging, so you would set those tags up in the vSphere client, and then we would consume those within vRealize operations to enable this policy. The other thing that you'll see here is there's a little tick mark, or there's a box that you can check for enable prioritization. And this is what it allows us to, or allows the policy to say, if there's room on the gold tier, then I'll allow silver VMs to run on that tier, but gold always has priority. So if the gold VMs need the gold tier resources, then it's going to push the silver VMs back into the silver tier to make sure that we're meeting our SLA for the gold. So that's it. That's basically all you have to set up. By the way, these categories are, we give you some examples out of the box, but you can make these categories actually anything you want. And we'll look at a different example where we're doing something a little bit differently. But once you have it, you can turn that on and save it. Once that policy is saved, the next thing that you'll want to do is you set your operational intent. Now, in the operational intent, I am setting priority on how aggressive I want to be about moving virtual machines to avoid bottlenecks or potential performance issues. And I have three options here. So I can do a balanced option where I have as much as possible equivalent headroom across all the virtual or all the clusters running in the environment. So I have this kind of peanut butter spread approach to capacity. The middle of the road is actually a moderate approach where it tries to give you the balance, but it's not as aggressive in achieving that. So the result is fewer moves, but it could impact performance. We're not going to be as aggressive about removing those performance bottlenecks. And then finally, consolidate. I want to move as many VMs onto as few clusters as possible, with the idea that I could maybe save resources, save some cost by either decommissioning or powering down those until they're needed, and so forth.
Hey, John.
Yes.
Got a question about, can we create tags without using vCenter?
So without using the vSphere client?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can do that through PowerShell.
So is that the only way, or?
Well, it's API? Supported through the API, the vSphere API. So yeah, you can, in any way that you can access those APIs, you could create. So programmatically, if that's kind of what you're getting at, like I provision a new application and I want to create tags for that application on the fly as part of like something like a VRA or CAS, absolutely, you could do that.
And one other comment, and I've never seen any of this stuff. There is so much white space, and I don't know if it's the way that the projector's working or whatever. It's almost boring me to death.
Okay.
There's so much white space on this. When you go back to the dashboard, it's just so white, and there's so much spaces in there, and you got to, and you're scrolling and you're moving. It just kind of, I wonder if there's a way that you could sort of change a little bit of the color of the background, condense some of that information, so I'm not scrolling through pages and pages and pages of stuff. Just give me something that I can do quick and easy, because if I can't, and if I have to go looking for a lot of stuff because, it's on this tab, and I scroll down and I go over here and I click that, then I get to the point where I go, you know what? I don't. Right. It doesn't bother. I won't bother anymore, and you just don't do it.
Yeah, no, that's great feedback, and it's definitely something we've been working on with every release, trying to get better about like the ease of use and the presentation of the information. Like I want the information that I need, and I don't want to have to go looking for it. So we're trying very hard. I was actually talking to a couple of PMs yesterday, looking at some of the stuff they have for the next release, and usability is key. In fact, I had a call this morning at 7 a.m. with one of our UX people, asking me, is like, what do you think this looks like? So point taken. Okay. And we'll certainly, I'm sure some of our PMs are even listening to this. So I appreciate that feedback.
Similar point, the business intent is not a business intent. That's still a technical It's an IT intent. It's still not business intent.
I actually have a kind of an additional question to go along with this. Can you expand a little more on what the differences are between those two for the user? Like if they want to set up an intent, so to speak, like can you elaborate a little bit more on what the difference is between those two boxes for creating intents?
Yeah, so and the business intent, as it's called in vRealize operations, really deals with placement to meet a goal. And it could be a business goal like an SLA, I have to meet a certain SLA, or it could be an operational goal like reduce cost of licensing, right? So it really has to do with what constraints do I want to put on my data centers in terms of where VMs reside for some reason that isn't related to resource consumption. When you get into the operational intent, that's where we start to talk about how do I use the resources that the VMs, once the VMs are placed, how are we using the resources that they consume? Do we want a balanced environment? And this next one, do we want to add additional headroom so that I, have capability to handle peaks in workload or unplanned provisioning of new VMs, those types of things. So that's kind of the difference. Does that help? Well,
yeah,
a little bit.
I guess I was kind of struggling to understand why the necessity for multiple wizards to create an intent, so to speak, when they're kind of, although I understand they're serving different purposes, to the user, you're still kind of putting guardrails around your environment.
Yeah.
So I could see how from a user perspective that could just be a little bit confusing.
Right. So, and that's a good point. But a couple of things to call out on that. One is going back to simplicity, right? So a lot of our customers initially, were telling us when we launched this, one of the reasons that we did workload optimization and this workload placement is because it's like, hey, I want to have my VMs spread equally across all my clusters. Okay, that's the way I want to operationalize my environment. So that was our first target. The business intent came later, if Alistair will let me use that word. The business intent came later because then we heard, okay, now you can do that, but we would also like to do, placement based on some requirement. So they're kind of two different things. You can do one or the other. You don't have to do both. You do have to do the operational intent. That's the minimum. You don't have to set a business intent if you don't want to. So if that's something you don't care about, no problem. The other thing is we have integration with vRealize Automation so that vRealize Automation already handles a lot of the things that we're calling business intent by virtue of blueprints, reservations policies, figuring out where things should live. So we don't want to violate what they're doing in terms of governance for placement of virtual machines by their policy. So what you'll see for those workloads or for VRA deployed workloads is we'll actually create a custom data center based on the reservation, and it will inherit the business intent of the VRA reservations. So that's another reason why there's a dichotomy between those.
I have a question. I may have missed it. What does BCA stand for?
That's just business critical applications.
Okay, so this, I may have missed it. So this looks like what DRS does and what admission control does.
Yes.
Is this a finer grained policy for specific applications?
Great question. So let me continue. I'll jump ahead to the next scenario and answer that question specifically if you'll allow. But the answer is yes. So we work with DRS. Actually, vRealize Operations has worked with DRS for quite some time. And one of the ways that we do this, you may have noticed in vSphere, there's when you're setting DRS settings up, there's an option to enable predictive DRS. That's actually an integration with vRealize Operations where vRealize Operations will feed DRS information about what it thinks is going to happen within the next 2 hours so that DRS can proactively move workloads instead of being reactive.
And this brings me to a question I would like to ask. I've been a user. Okay, the direct question is, at this point of the evolution of vRops, would it make sense for vRops to replace vCenter? Because I'm a user since version 6.2 of vRops, and I saw the product evolving and changing its skin. And I'm seeing like things like the one that you just showed is basically a DRS for the data center itself.
Sure. Yes.
So it's like a superset of functionalities that vCenter provides natively. So what confuses me is why should I manage my infrastructure using two different tools, both sophisticated and complex,
Right.
when I should and could do all my operation from one single entry point. So if vRops is evolving and taking some of the responsibilities of vCenter and being able to bring intelligence that vCenter doesn't have, wouldn't it make sense to strip vCenter of some of its advanced features, including the UI, and bring them into vRops and use vCenter just like a controller for the infrastructure?
Right.
Maybe even without a GUI.
So I get what you're saying. I think when you look at the features so I don't want to downplay anything that vCenter does, like, vMotion, storage vMotion, DRS, storage DRS, all those things are capabilities that have been built, proven, and work very well. What we don't want to do is replace those. We want to augment those with this capability. To your point, well, why couldn't I just do this all from vRops? You can once you've used vCenter to set those policies. And in fact, in here, we'll actually show you going down to the bottom of the screen here. And I'm scrolling, Jim, because it is the screen resolution that's making me do that.
Okay.
But if I look at the DRS summary, so I can consume information about DRS where I would normally have to go into the vSphere client to get that information. And I can also set my DRS policies in here as well. So we'll show you information about, go back to workload optimization. Let me actually scroll down. I can actually set my DRS automation here. So yeah, I can do this without going into vCenter, using vCenter as kind of the primary method of bootstrapping my SDDC, getting everything configured, and then once it's configured, vRops can come in and reside on top of it. So we're getting better with the integration. There's also a plugin in the vSphere client, the web client now, that shows you some information from vRealize operations as well.
But still it's jumping back and forth.
The whole message at the beginning was it's got to be easy to consume and simple.
Yep.
And as everybody in this room knows, I have a bend toward the SMB, and having to layer on multiple tools is another reason why. But ultimately, to Pietro's point, it's got to be simple, and everybody wants this information.
I don't mind using a more abstracted, more general, more capable tool instead of vCenter. I just don't want to mess up things having to jump from one thing to another. For me, vCenter changed. It was a bulky Windows implementation with external database and everything. Now we have the VSA. I wouldn't mind if, like we did with the transition from ESX to ESXi, if also vCenter could reduce its footprint up to a point, it becomes just a manager, a broker, an endpoint, and then I would do all the administration and the operational task through vRops. I see that vRops is getting more and more capable.
We're getting
so
there,
at some point, it should be the only.
And I think right. I don't disagree. I don't think we're totally there. But when you look at stuff like this, where I can make settings I would normally have to jump out to the client to do from this interface, and even things like in the latest addition of the Orchestrator management pack for vRealize operations, you can even do things like decommission hosts, put them in maintenance mode and things like that from within the vRealize operations UI.
vRops came with a Python controller, right?
Right, but that was not extensible,
Exactly.
but now you can extend it with Orchestrator. Yeah.
So it would be great to have a way to have kind of Python controller on steroids so that all the actual actions could be,
Yep. And that's the Orchestrator management pack. Absolutely. So when we get into the troubleshooting section, I'll talk a little bit about that, and you'll see how we use it for auto remediation of host configuration, for example, based on an alert. You can fully automate it, fix NTP settings, SSH, whatever settings on the host that you want without touching the vCenter web client. So before I run out of time in this segment, I want to go through this last scenario here to address the question of DRS integration. So that's actually one component of the DRS integration that we have. But when we look at this custom data center is host-based licensing. And the idea here is that if we look at the business intent, the reason we did this is because customers are telling us, I have license constraints for placement of my virtual machines. I don't want to license every host in the environment to run Oracle. I also don't want to dedicate a cluster to Oracle or Microsoft or whatever the license requirement may be. So I want the ability, when you're enforcing placement or placing virtual machines within the environment, to do it at a host level so that I can make sure that Oracle virtual machines are running on hosts that are licensed for Oracle. And so we can do that, and the way that we do that is with DRS. So we'll actually, when you turn this on, what happens is we'll actually review any of the DRS rules that you may have created already in the environment, make sure that those don't conflict, and we'll create for you the DRS rules that will enforce this policy. Fully automated, which I like because there's no chance that someone can make a mistake. And if someone comes later and tries to create a user-defined rule that violates this policy, vRealize operations will say, no, we're going to disable that rule because it violates the policy you've set here. And of course, you can turn this off. You can come back and modify it. But we'll create the VM groups, the host groups, the rules. Everything is done for you, through this, by virtue of this very simple to use wizard. Once I've done that, you can see that there are tag violations for license enforcement. And if I go down and I look at the individual clusters, I can even see that the specific virtual machines that are violating that. So I've got an Oracle VM that's running on and I'll have to move this out a little bit so you can see. It's running on it's kind of hard to see there, but that's a Microsoft host group. And so we've got a tag violation. So what would happen is I would click Optimize Now, and it'll do two things. It'll figure out, okay, what do I need to move based on the intents? What can I move based on other constraints, for vMotion, vSwitch? So we're working with vCenter on your behalf to make sure that everything that can be vMotioned actually will be vMotioned. And we'll come up with basically a plan that shows you what we're going to move, where we're going to move it from and to, including vSAN clusters, between vSAN clusters, and we'll tell you exactly why we're doing it. We're doing it to balance the workload between clusters, or we're doing it to mitigate a tagging violation for host-based placement. So does that answer the question with regard to, hey, this is, we're doing kind of the same thing as DRS, and we are, but within the cluster, we're letting DRS continue to do what DRS does. We're just making it a lot easier for you to manage that. And then between clusters, that's where we're doing the movement of VMs to meet those intents. So I just want to make sure that answers your question or concern.
It seems like there might be some situations where your workload optimization and your business intent are going to step on each other's toes. Will this essentially tell you, okay, we're seeing this situation and allow you to decide which one you want to take priority?
The business intent will take priority over the operational intent.
Okay.
Yeah, so placement of the VMs is the priority. You know, where do I want these to live to achieve some goal? And then we'll use the operational intent to figure out, okay, given that constraint, how can we address the imbalance between those? And you can see, you come up with this plan. We show you a before and after from the standpoint, and I'm sorry, in the room, this may be a little hard to read, but we're showing you, hey, this is the best that we can balance given all the constraints. And that's why it took us a little while to kind of churn that information. And this is all done with machine learning, you know, behind the scenes. And then we'll say, you know, why we're moving stuff and so forth.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on, when you say machine learning, this is based on that. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how it's making that decision? How has this been learned? By looking at existing workloads?
Yes.
But which workloads have you targeted upon? Because while you can rely on machine learning based decisions, you also have to have the confidence that is it the right thing to do or not? So if you can elaborate a little bit about how it works.
Yeah, so in our case, the capacity, there's a capacity engine behind this. We introduced it with 6.7. It was we kind of scrapped what we had before and added this new engine. And so it's looking at historically the behavior of the consumption of resources, you know, by the VMs, how they're being used on the hosts and clusters, and so forth. And so we have a couple of different algorithms, I guess, would be the best way, and I'm not a mathematician, but we have a couple of algorithms that will look at things like periodicity. You know, is this something that happens frequently on a regular interval, so we understand that, you know, this is something that we should plan for in terms of where, you know, when we do our placement, when we make those predictive DRS recommendations. And we also have exponential decay of the metric data. So the most recent data, performance data for a VM, has a higher weight than the older data, and it starts to tail off or taper off after some time. So those are two examples of how we use that, and then we combine that information with, you know, the obviously the consumption of resources of other virtual machines within a cluster, and then we can predict, and that'll be in the next demo. I'll show you kind of this prediction that we make based on those inputs and the machine learning, and it's constantly being updated, right? So when you turn it on initially, you'll see that you have you know, some prediction, like almost within a few hours. But that prediction, as we learn more about the behavior of those, we identify periods of, you know, periodicity of repetitive workloads and things like that, then we'll adjust that prediction over time.
They're still learning from your own environment.
It's your environment, yes.
But not, say, for example, is it not learning from, say, I don't know, deployments all around the world, from whoever wants to share that information?
Not yet.
Not yet. Right, okay.
So we received a question about the business intent from Ariel Sanchez, and he wants to know, could it also be called the optimization rule since it fine-tunes from the base vCenter features? Yeah,
Absolutely. So if it helps to think of it that way, that's certainly, I think, a valid, maybe better than business intent. But yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is, you know, these are guardrails that I need to put on the environment because of some constraint that either a constraint that was placed upon me by the business, or it could be a goal that I'm trying to achieve operationally. So it differs a little bit depending on your use case. So if that's the way you intend to use it, then absolutely that's the way I would think about it. But it has some flexibility, right? So I think that's fair.